But that's not building an experimentation culture. That's just like giving people candy. Of course, everyone wants candy. But at the end of the day, before we can even talk about, are we ready for experimentation? It's like, are we ready for failure? Can you develop the discipline to talk through what was the hypothesis and therefore what did we learn? And not just for our team, but what does this say about our understanding of our buyers and how can we disseminate those learnings? So I think that's actually at the core, because if that is at the core, then you don't need to wait until you can run statistically significant experiment.
Welcome to Growthmates, the place to connect with inspiring leaders to help you grow yourself and your product. Here you can learn how companies like Dropbox, Adobe, Amplitude, Canva, and many more are building excellent products and growth culture. Please press follow to support us and get new episodes. This time we talked to Emily Wang, CEO of Bento, previously product manager on growth team at Intercom. Emily shared her authentic story of becoming a founder, the role of leadership, creating a company culture, and building a strong team. Our conversation went beyond that, and we also discussed what's the right time to introduce experimentation, why killing features is necessary to grow and evolve your product, and why product-led growth model sometimes is not the right fit, and what we all should be aware of in the current market landscape. If you find our show valuable, please share it with your colleagues and friends. To receive all episodes right in your inbox, subscribe to katesyuma.substack.com. Your support means a lot to us. Last thing before we dive into today's episode, I've got an exciting announcement for you. If you are keen on mastering product growth and user onboarding, join our upcoming course in April. Teaming up with my ex-Miro colleague, we will personally guide you to create a stellar onboarding experience and share the frameworks we've collected for years. For more details and early access, find the link in the episode description. So now, let's dive in. Hello everyone, welcome to Growthmates. Emily, we are so happy to have you here today. And you have a very exciting career, and personally for me, even a role model. You have a Harvard MBA, huge experience as a product manager in companies like Intercom, Tear Springs, Spoke, and already for 3 years, you're building your own product, Bento, as a CEO. And for me, it's like just incredible role model personally. And I'd like to start today's conversation by asking you, what was your mission when you decided to shift from a comfortable full-time job as a head of product and start your own company, Bento?
Yeah. Well, I think for a lot of people who end up becoming founders, it doesn't matter what role you're in, you find ways to make it uncomfortable, because I think for so many of us, we look for opportunities to grow. And I really think that those two things go hand in hand, discomfort and growth. But, I think I learned so much from working closely with the founders at Spoke and, obviously in prior startup roles. And, for so many of us, there's this itch to bring not just an idea to life, but the ability to craft a company and a culture around it. We think about impact and, I think there's obviously impact through software and tooling, but also just through the ways in which we can work with the people around us. Because I had spent, almost a decade in product, I obviously spent a lot of time thinking about things that hold PMs back from being able to do their best work. Originally, Bento started off as a collaboration tool for PMs, really around helping them understand what was happening in all of the different silos and tools and conversations related to their project. But as we even were working on that, we realized that, there's such a big gap between getting people excited about an idea and actually having them adopt a piece of software. And we did all the things that, YC and others recommend, like you one-on-one onboard your customers. You spend a lot of time talking to them. And all of those are very true and valid. But the thing I kept realizing is that people are busy and their memories are very, very short. And so you can spend so much time with them up front. And when they finally make their way into your product a week later, 2 weeks later, they actually can't remember what they're meant to do. And it's not to say that they can't click around the right buttons or perform tasks, but that broader mission of why am I doing this, assuming it's not for entertainment, that's all gone. And I think that's a problem that so many of us face as designers, as PMs. We spend our entire careers crafting these delightful user experiences, but most of us aren't doing it for entertainment. And so if you're not doing it for entertainment, then the person on the other side has to come up for motivation on their own. And in any given moment, it can be hard to remember that. And so coming back to Bento, the idea was, okay, how do we make sure that all this great product that is being designed and built and iterated upon, when the person on the other side actually logs in to use it, you can really surface back to them why they're here. And that was the original mission, and I think continues to be the foundation of what we do. Obviously, along the way, a lot of it ends up being growth mechanics, experimentation, even some of the more classic, guidance capabilities. But yeah, really started with, I think for so many founders, what are the problems that, you yourself have faced, and how do you use software, right, to really scale and unlock opportunity?
Wonderful. I'm happy that today we will have time to dive into your product building philosophy and also into product-led growth as a motion that you had experience with, both as like a full-time employee and also as a CEO trying to define the business model for your own product. But probably before we jump into these topics, could you tell also a bit more about your personal mental model shift or intention when you really decided to step out from a role in a company and become a founder? Because I assume it requires a lot of mental model shift. And yeah, I see a lot of similar examples right now happening in the industry, and I admire these examples. And I hope our listeners, by listening to your story, can also probably think about their career and if in the long-term future they could also step into a founder's path.
Yeah, of course. I think one thing a lot of people talk about is just the lack of structure that you walk into. When you are inside of a company, you have a role. Even if at a startup that role is blurry, you have a role. You have a manager. And so there is just a lot of ways with which there are boundaries of context that you have to know, boundaries of OKRs or metrics that you're responsible for. And at the end of the day, a way to escalate if something's going wrong. And again, as people advance in their careers, that scope grows and it gets fuzzier. But when you walk into the founding role, there's very little, right, that's predefined for you. No one's going to promote you to the next level. No one is really there to grade you. Actually, Michael Seibel at YC, I think in every batch reminds founders that if you're the kind of person who really needs external validation to tell you that you are doing a good job, to tell you are doing better than your peers, then being a founder is the wrong role for you. Because actually a lot of what you end up hearing externally is this thing is broken, you don't have enough features, your competitor does this thing better, this potential candidate got offered more money. It's very easy to just see problems, around you. And so I think cultivating this muscle to not just have confidence in the skills that you have, but to have confidence in your ability to learn and master new skills, to have confidence in your ability to step into opacity and create clarity and structure. That is, I think, one of the biggest things. You put your stock in who you are, not in how great of a designer you are and how much of a design system you own. But you put your stock in your ability to be an incredibly resilient learner and experimenter. And that if you get it wrong, that's just another input into the experimentation and learning engine, as opposed to if you get something wrong, that being a remark on who you are and your skills. So lots has been said, I think, around the psychology of being a founder and how that, I think, is the thing that is maybe most different. But that's certainly been true of my experience.
Super. I would like to talk about how was your experience, because you started the product yourself while you decided to start the company and you're now the CEO of the company. But of course, I would like to understand what motivated you to start this product in particular, this idea, and if you as a founder established any particular fundamentals for the product to thrive.
Yeah. Well, I think going back to, the earlier story, Bento originally started off as a different idea. And after we built a V1 of that original Bento product and tried to get customers to use it, I myself kept also facing this problem of how do we, help people really understand why they're in this tool, not click on these buttons in my vertical navigation because, V1 products tend to be very simple. I would write all of these, very, very personalized follow-up emails. Hey, Kate, we talked about this problem and here's why you can use Bento to have these great outcomes. comes. And, you would watch people open these emails, but it might be a day or two before they log back into your application. And like many of us, I would obsessively watch session replays. And you would just watch people click around. And sometimes they would start to do things, but you could tell it was very superficial. And, we started thinking about, okay, what would it look like to be able to have like an admin level experience where I could go into Retool, right? And maybe rewrite some copy so that when people landed in, the copy for Kate was specific to the conversation that we had. And as I was noodling on this, I was like, oh, this actually reminds me a lot of some of the problems we worked on as the growth team at Intercom. Not quite at that level of individuality. How do we make this relevant for you? And relevant not just based on your role and title, but based on your job to be done. And I won't belabor sort of the job to be done framework. I think, many people, especially at Intercom, have done a tremendous job of unpacking it, but I think it's very relevant. And I think pulling on that thread made me realize, okay, this is a problem that I've actually, had the fortune of spending a couple of years working on when I was at Intercom. It's the type of problem that all of these software companies around me are facing. And while the exact execution might look different company to company, and the content looks different company to company, it's the same mechanics. It's the same mechanics of trying to create something that is relevant, delightful, hopefully not too obtrusive, that is fed in by data that you have about a customer, and that hopefully adapts based on new data that you're getting about people's usage, about the way they're answering poll questions and survey questions. And that then becomes the possibility for infrastructure, right? For tooling. And so I remember working with a friend to mock up the first few flows of Bento, and we took it to a couple of friends of mine, and they were like, oh, you should see what my designers and PMs are currently working on because it looks very, very similar. And I think that's actually what got us to our first few paying contracts, was just realizing, so many of us are building the same things under the hood. And I think what ends up happening is you spend so much time talking about, should we have 3 cards or should we have 5 accordions? And how do we negotiate between what sales wants versus what CS wants versus what the product wants? We end up spending our time as these EPD teams on the mechanics of the execution, as opposed to what are the problems that we're solving. When people, and we'll talk about this later, but you hear people talk about, we're moving towards PLG all the time. And I ask, what does that mean to you and your team? And it's met with a lot of shrugs or, it means everything. And so the hope always, I think, with great tooling is not that you are taking someone's job, but that you get to help them carve out time, right? To really have those difficult but important conversations around strategy and goals.
3 years into the journey of Bento already. When I started in companies that were in very early stages, it was quite hard to generate this infrastructure that allows the company to experiment, to kind of create experiments in products and actually learn in a faster way. And it was super hard in my case to convince the C-levels of the importance of experimentation on that concrete moment. For you, Emily, when do you think is the right time to introduce experimentation in a product so you can get those learnings?
Yeah, I think we talk about this a lot, but experimentation to me is always so much more around experimentation culture and how people respond to failure. I had a chat with Willie Tran. If you don't know him, he has worked extensively in growth. Yeah, it sounds like
he was our first guest on our first episode here on Growthmates.
What a small world. Okay, so fun story.
Willie
and I met, many years ago when I was at Intercom in a lift line. I don't know if they have these things anymore, but definitely pre-COVID, you could save some money if you did a carpool. And in San Francisco, you meet all sorts of interesting people in your carpool. And that's how Willie and I first met. He was doing growth at Dropbox, and I was doing growth at Intercom. But one of the things that we talked about that I think he framed really nicely is if you go into a team, especially a growth team, and your leadership thinks that the success of the team is just about moving a metric, then you're setting yourself up for failure. Because anytime you walk into a new domain, creating a help center, creating a marketing site, you have so much low-hanging fruit that of course your V1, your V2s are going to be winning, right? Because there's just stuff on the ground. You just have so many easy problems you haven't fixed. But that's not building an experimentation culture, right? That's just like giving people candy. Of course everyone wants candy. But at the end of the day, before we can even talk about are we ready for experimentation, it's like, are we ready for failure? And when the experiment goes wrong or when the experiment doesn't move a needle, is that it, right? Like, oh, we had a failed experiment. Or can you develop the discipline to talk through what was the hypothesis and therefore what did we learn? And not just for our team, but what does this say about our understanding of our buyers, of our current go-to-market, of our marketing positioning, of our pricing and packaging, of the usability of our product, and how can we disseminate those learnings? So I think that's actually at the core, because if that is at the core, then you don't need to wait until you can run statistically significant experiment, right? You can run an experiment where you change a part of a flow and you watch 3 users use it and see if it's different. And as designers, right, there's oftentimes a deep, reliance and muscle around user research, which is part of that experimentation. One of my favorite kinds of experiments, and one that we do a lot actually, even at Bento, even as a new company, is killing features. And I call it Marie Kondoing. And I started this when I was at Spoke because I read the opening chapter of Mark Benioff's book. I think it's called like Behind the Cloud. He talks about starting Salesforce. And there's this paragraph where he talks about creating a delightfully simple user experience and how that would be better than the existing software products out there. And I thought, oh my gosh, even Salesforce, but of course, even Salesforce started by wanting to create a delightful, simple user experience. No software practitioner wakes up and says, I'm going to create something difficult, right? And yet, like entropy, like the actual just physics of it creates layers and layers and layers of complexity. And so that's the fate of all software. And so if we don't actively fight that, and it's not just through redesigning UI, which is part of it, I think oftentimes just to kill things. So there are features that we have killed in Bento where we have actually proactively told customers, here's why we're killing it. Here's how it's going to come back in a different form later. It will be better. And sometimes there's features that we just kill and we just wait to see, does anyone yell about it? And it turns out a lot of times people don't. It's this feature someone used once 6 months ago and our understanding of our product changes. And so the way we would go about building it now would be different than 6 months ago. So those are great experiments. Kill things, see if people shout about it. And that's a win because you've just now opened up a little bit more space for you to build that next feature without it just adding on. So it's one of the first custom emojis that I always make in new teams is the Marie Kondo one or a broom. And we just celebrate that as much as we celebrate shipping new things.
Yeah, I agree that sometimes it's better to kill something that having there, no one using it, and simplify the product is actually part of growing the product. Going back to your experience in Intercom, I wanted to talk about foundations and experimentation. Lots of times we want to experiment with new things, but there will be a team that is more in charge of product, and it will be sometimes kind of a blocker for new experiments to come. Like, for example, working at Miro, something that might affect or might go against the design system that we have. And therefore, there will be always this discussion going back and forth until we reach an agreement and until we can run that experiment and learn. So given your experience, I would like to know if you have ever come to this situation and how did you deal with it? Like, is there any kind of framework that you can apply in this kind of cases where like both teams will be happy and the experiments will thrive and we can keep learning as fast as possible?
I think that one of the big fears of experimentation is that naturally the experiment tends to be an MVP, right? Because you don't want to overinvest in something that might not work. And so it's an MVP in its interactions, it's an MVP in the code. And the fear is that whether that experiment goes well or poorly, we will forget to, or we will not have the conviction to do the follow-on section, right? That's always the fear. Because if you knew 100% of the time, there would be the follow-up to refactor the code appropriately, to reintegrate the UX appropriately, then suddenly it's okay, right? Like these conversations start to change, but we are so conditioned because we all move so quickly that that's what, doesn't happen. And so I think it's worth at the very least addressing that and as a team having a conversation around in what sprint are we actually carving out time on the design roadmap, on the engineering roadmap to do the follow-on. And the follow-on can be rip it out, remove the feature flag, or the follow-on can be refactor the whole. But if that conversation isn't had, then, we sit with this uncertainty. And I think that, of course, differs, right, on how deeply integrated the experiment is. I think, for example, pricing experiments are very tricky because you can't just go to customers and just change their prices all the time. There's a lot of communication, a lot of overhead that happens with those types of migrations, a lot of sometimes dealing with angry customers. positioning copy type of experiments, much, much simpler to run. Or even figuring out, in Bento, one of the most common experiments that people do run as they think about both onboarding and activation and cross-sell is who should see what kinds of paths and flows. And again, earlier we talked about job to be done, but there are people who want to think about this as, are you familiar with my kind of tool or not? So for example, in the last 3 years, we have seen a lot of new sales tools come out, email automation, scheduling, etc. If you are a salesperson and you have used one sales tool for 5 years and now you are coming into a new one, the way you have to change your mental model is probably quite different than if you're a brand new salesperson and you have no prior art. And so if I ask you, are you an SDR? That's not a useful question. I need to know, what did you use before? And based on what you used before, and then I can help design or teach, the right path. That's not even about job to be done because you have the exact same job to be done. And so there's so many different ways of cutting why someone might show up and what it is that they need to see to understand and get to value. Those are things that, at Bento, we help customers run all the time. And the reason you can run those so quickly with Bento is that they tend to be more client-side, messaging, opting into different paths, and then testing content. Content and form factors, I think, is one of the most under-tested but highest lever experiments out there. I was chatting with a growth PM over at Figma, and I think so much of the experiments that they've also been doing is, what should be a GIF? What should be a screenshot? What should just be a little bit of like a UI shimmer? And being able to actually experiment on those things has actually unlocked a lot. So, again, I think it's upfront having a conversation with a broader set of stakeholders to understand if the experiment goes well or poorly, how are we planning on integrating it? And then in terms of the experiment itself, figuring out what is, big, expensive. Expensive isn't just code expensive, right? But that's sort of like customer mental model, emotionally sensitive type of testing, and what is actually very, very simple testing. And I think being able to matrix that then hopefully allows the team to at least get going and start to build those cultural muscles and that trust around closing the loop. And then you can get it just a little bit more complicated experiments.
It actually reminded me about the importance of clear alignment in the very beginning on what will be next. So sometimes, like you mentioned, the situation when we just don't know how we will operate, if this experiment is successful, is semi-successful, or not successful at all. And our stakeholders, they have a lot of anxiety about this uncertainty. And if we just create a map and show all possible scenarios and say what we do in this and that situation, and showing that we will iterate for sure, or we will polish the code for sure, it will help to eliminate this uncertainty on this alignment level and make it faster. Because what I'm most worried about, that these experiments that you've mentioned with the copy, with the visuals, they just don't even get to the production point because of the time-consuming and exhausting alignment that is happening over and over. And after that, you just say oh my God, we were discussing this screen for a week and it doesn't worth it. We will not launch it, unfortunately. So thanks for sharing these examples, especially from Figma, because I think this story is quite successful. They focus on product experience, polishing the jobs to be done, and content is a good leverage for that. Maybe this example can inspire the broader community to look in that direction.
Yeah, exactly. I think the only other way it made me think about summarizing that is spend the time up front, right, on that alignment and on what happens in these different scenarios. And then on the execution side, just move quickly. Because if you have confidence that without what you're shipping isn't going to be out there forever and ever and ever, then it doesn't have to be agreed upon by 7 people that this is the right copy. The whole point of experimentation is to let your customers tell you anyway.
Getting back to your point of killing features, it can happen that we will even kill this experience after experiment or after a certain amount of time. And I think still in the community, in the product community, in the product building development approach, it's not that common that you kill your experiences. Our products that we are using today are very complicated. And the fear or the barrier to kill a feature or to simplify it is very, very high. And I've seen only in growth teams this flexibility to actually be comfortable with the situation that whatever you build can be killed. And however, in a traditional product development process, it's like you're building something, you're building your emotional connection to this outcome. And I think it's very interesting how we can educate teams to build things with the idea that everything can be changed. It can be reversed or killed in the end, and it's fine. In the end, we are optimizing for a bigger mission and bigger problem to solve and product in the end. And probably this is somehow connected with the concept of product-led growth. It's probably a different definition of that that I just created on the go. But Emily, I'm very curious to hear your thoughts and talk to you about this topic of product-led growth motion. We hear this word very often. Right now, we hear a lot of successful stories, how companies introduce product-led growth, how it helped them. But we don't hear a lot of stories how it didn't fit the company or how it wasn't even suitable for the company to become purely product-led. And I'm curious to hear your perspective. So how do you think about this approach and combination of models, and why maybe Bento is also not purely product-led? Because I know that you found something like unique for your business.
Yeah. I mean, one, I think a lot has been written about product-led growth, and the ones that I think can really capture the nuances will all say it's a spectrum, right? It's not a binary of you are or you aren't. And it's also, I think, at the end of the day, about what parts of the funnel you want your product to play a larger role. I think at the beginning of the pandemic, a lot of what I heard people get excited about for product-led growth was this idea that, your product would be viral. Somebody would use your product, would tell other people about your product, and that's how, it would, or they would, share a link, and then that's how people would get in. And, the two of you, I think, can definitely appreciate that mechanic. But that's, I think selling the story short. I think at the end of the day with product-led growth, I think what we're saying is, let's look at the way traditional, sort of more sales-led, traditional enterprise companies have done things. And how do we bend the arc so that the people who are using the product and so that the product itself has a bigger seat at the table? So, to grossly simplify it, in a lot of companies today, multi-million-dollar contracts are sold without anyone ever using the product, right? These products are sold purely through demos, through decks, through case studies, and it's incredible to me. And so one of the first things that we say is we believe that the buyer is going to expect to get their hands onto the product and actually use it at some point before they decide to buy it. Okay, well, if that's true, then it means that they have to be able to use it, ideally in their own setup or with their own data. And that gets to the question of implementation. And at so many companies, you have an implementation manager, a human who sets everything up for you, either because there's no interface for it or because it's really, really difficult. And I think that's why you oftentimes see onboarding and PLG being very closely coupled. And then on the other side of the spectrum, you see things like the actual moment of buying, the conversion itself. Is it product-led or not? If I really simplify it, do I put down a credit card or do I convince, a C-level person to sign a contract? But that has a lot to do with pricing as well. No one is going to put down their credit card for a $10,000 product. Also, very few people are going to put down a credit card for a tool that is a cross-functional decision to purchase. Because then you get into questions like whose budget does it go on, who owns the tool, etc. And so, when we thought about what PLG meant for Bento, we believed in three things. Number one, we believed that the product always had to be very self-serviceable. You could sign up for an account. You could, within the product, understand the core paths, the core jobs to be done. You could, so that's like sort of the discovery and the understanding. You could go through all the mechanics of building experiences in Bento and then actually setting them live inside of your own application. And, eventually you can also now put down a credit card and just buy. So the mechanics have to be very self-serve. But one of the big things that we learned is that you have to have a certain level of company maturity before growth or activation becomes a really important strategic problem. because early on, you're still trying to figure out core product value and core product market fit. And once you're in a bigger company, well, then lots of people are involved, right? The product team is obviously involved because it lives in the product, but oftentimes marketing or customer success actually has a really big voice as well. And the thing that we all want to avoid is that marketing buys one tool to send in-app messages, customer support buys another tool to send in-app messages and be a chat bubble, and then the product teams buy another tool for surveys and another tool for in-app growth. And so we realized very quickly that these conversations end up being very cross-functional. And because these decisions get made at a higher level and it requires organizing a lot of people and aligning a lot of people, it wasn't really going to lend itself to a simple, oh, let's just buy the product and go. It happens, right? So at Bento, there's a healthy amount of our new customers that we never really talk to. But the bigger accounts are the ones where we have an opportunity to be a strategic advisor in how we've seen things. Also, very early on, hear feedback, right, around not just what's missing in the product, but what organizationally are they trying to solve for. And so all of those types of complexities lend themselves actually very well to a more quote-unquote traditional sales-led model. But we've never had a sale that doesn't go through some sort of a trial or a POC. And so I think in that sense, it doesn't matter whether our revenue is mostly invoicing or credit card. Our product always plays a really, really critical part throughout the sales process. So in that sense, is it product-led? Is it not? I think that is exactly that nuance, that spectrum that we talk about.
It reminded me about the concept of product-led sales that actually was introduced by Reforge on their last product-led growth course, is that your product itself generates these product qualified accounts and leads that your sales team can pick up and leverage and convert, or even your product, while you're demonstrating it, can create certain buy-in. So the combination of both works quite well. And I loved your idea of visualizing it as a spectrum. And there is neither this extreme situation. I hear a lot from people in the community and people who are reaching out to me for advice that, hey, Kate, we are trying to shift or switch to product-led growth. And for me, it's a yellow flag. I'm just curious to ask them, what do you expect from that? You already have your sales motion working well. Why do you need to switch anywhere? It's not about switch. It's about finding this unique combination that will work for you, for your product. I like the concept that you've mentioned that not all products are self-servable, let's say. Sometimes the product will never be that user-friendly in a self-serve way if you will not atomize certain points of setting up or setting up the infrastructure around these tools, if it's something very, very complex and technical. So I think what I'm curious also to talk to you is about your past experience at Intercom. You worked in this company during their chapter of being more product-led, but after that they shifted more to sales-led. And recently we talked to Tom, actually last week, who is a design director at Intercom. And now they are also switching back to some sort of combination of sales-led and product-led. And I'm curious to hear your thoughts and perspective from your experience at a more scaled company as Intercom, and why you think these shifts happened that time, or why these shifts are happening for companies at a bigger scale from one to another and trying to find the fit.
I think one of the most common patterns that you see is, especially in B2B SaaS, is companies moving up market. And, if I grossly simplify why that happens, a lot of times is that you have better retention, right? Small companies go out of business, small companies change their ideas. So you have just a much longer life cycle with your customer. And then, of course, you get a lot more money, right? And oftentimes, yes, it's more maybe difficult or expensive to sell into a large company. Small customers can also be very, very expensive to serve. So for all the great sort of business reasons, everyone moves upmarket. Upmarket buyers have a different way of buying. They are friends with a bunch of salespeople. They have renewal cycles, right? They're not always looking for new tooling. They might be in a 3-year-long contract. So they're not looking for a replacement tool until 3 years later. And they're a large company, which means there's a lot of different stakeholders, right, who have opinions and perspectives. And so if you want to move upmarket for all the great business reasons we talked about, and if the upmarket buyers buy in an existing way that is more sales-led, then the equation says you become more sales-led. You have to have a seat at the table. You have to understand when their 3-year-long renewal cycle happens. You have to understand who are the 43 people involved in this decision-making. So I don't think it's, maybe put differently, I didn't observe it as the product team somehow saying, oh, we'll just build features, you sell it, right? I think it stemmed from a very reasonable, very natural, very common pattern that ends up happening. Now, if you now start having a bunch of customers who are paying you $1 million a year, and you have a bunch of customers who are paying you $1,000 a year, your priorities on R&D roadmap start to shift. And of course, you build more security features, more enterprise features. None of this is new. And so again, if it is a spectrum, then all we're really saying is for every company, for every culture within a company, you're trying to find the moment on that spectrum that feels right to you, that serves not only your board and your investor stakeholders, but also the dreams and the hopes and the identity of maybe the founding team. And so I think that's probably where like the shift back is coming from. And I think at the end of the day, we're all looking for balance. Even the companies that are, very enterprisey, again, nobody is delighted to have a difficult product. Everyone wants the same things. We just have limited resources, right, and priorities to call out. But I think one of the other things I'd probably sort of like add to this is, again, we talk about product-led growth and product-led sales, but maybe the step before that is actually just product-accelerated growth or product-accelerated sales. If I think about what happens at Bento, it's not so much that we listen for signals of usage within our product and then we reach out. It's oftentimes that we are in a conversation with someone, then they're using the product, and then they're like, oh, I get it. The demo was cool, but now that I see this in our product, I really get it. And that's what motivates me to buy. So the product accelerates the sales process, but it doesn't have to be the one to start it. And I just offer that up because I think for so many companies who are trying to make that shift, if your product can't even be an accelerant or a catalyst to your sales process or to your adoption process, then asking it to lead is a really, really big ask. And so again, even, I haven't been at Intercom in many years, but I'd be curious if Intercom is truly going back to product-led growth or if they're really just looking for more opportunities for the product to have more of a focus on accelerating those motions in a way that it hasn't over the last few years.
Yeah, let's see what will happen with Intercom and other companies who are trying to find the match and mix. And when you said like this metaphor of product accelerated growth, it makes me think about my personal mission and like importance of user experience for self-serve products. Because if your user experience inside the product is not self-servable, is not intuitive, is not understandable, if you are deprioritizing that over and over, then nothing will happen. No acceleration will happen. A lot of churn can happen, but in order to build this product-led growth motion, the core experience, the core functionality, the product itself should already have a certain quality bar. And this is why I think that sometimes companies right now on this craziness around product-led growth, trying to think about that too early or prioritizing that over actual foundations and core product positioning experience and, certain functionality. And yeah, I think this is interesting to find the balance here and there. And sometimes this is my assumption because of the amount of content around product-led growth. Maybe this is something that is coming not just from bottom-up internally in teams, but also top-down from investors and the other world. And as you're staying in touch with this community of founders and investors, I'm curious to hear what kind of macro environment shifts have you seen recently and how it can impact the tactics or approach to product-led growth in the upcoming years or year, if you have seen any changes or shifts from the community of like investors and founders that can impact the concept of product-led growth and its adoption.
Yeah. If I think back to 2 to 3 years ago, you know, and your investor asked, like, what are you doing about PLG? It was, I think, oftentimes in the context of how do you grow faster? So you have this existing thing. If you add PLG, maybe you can grow 5 times faster. I think now when the question gets asked, what are you doing about PLG? Or I don't even know if that question gets asked quite so specifically anymore. I think it becomes much more around what is your sort of path to efficient sales and efficient support. You know, like humans are expensive, but it's not just the fact that humans are expensive. It's the fact that, you know, you are blocked on someone's calendar, right? It takes a lot of time. You can only touch so many people. Even if you're doing very handheld implementation and training, you can only train the first 5 people that were involved. But a year from now, those 5 people have become 10 and only 2 of the previous people were still there, right? It's a rotating door always, and you just can't keep up. And so then it's inefficient, right, to continue to try to chase after this. And obviously in the last year, as we've seen the macro climate change, it's become not the question of how do you grow 5 times faster, but how do you make sure that, you know, the sales that you're bringing in are converting well? Okay, how can you use your product to augment that? How can you reduce your time to activation from, 45 days down to 15 days? Okay, well, if I don't have to wait for 3 calls to get scheduled, maybe that's one way to do it. And in order to do that, the product has to play a much bigger role. Product and things around it, right? I think it's important to think about these things as a portfolio. You should have a great help center, right? It doesn't matter if you have great in-app experiences and there's no help center for people to go and search. Having things like webinars or YouTube videos, depending on what your audience likes, can be really effective. And so I think really holistically thinking about that scaled motion. And then I think the other thing we're hearing a lot about is how do you, to your customers prove ROI? And that was really tricky. I'm sure you guys had these conversations at Miro, but like, what is the ROI of a better collaboration session? It's incredibly hard to measure. And I think what's so interesting is that it really requires dialogue. Like the only way to know how much better the collaboration impacted money at the end of the day, right? Because hopefully we're not firing people. We're like keeping all the people. So there's no cost savings. It's just outcome. Is that you have to understand how they perceive the value or the benchmarks that they have today. And it's very qualitative. I think similarly with Bento, some of our customers have good baselines when they come to us and they say, X percentage of our customers are able to self-serve activate. We think we can, triple that if we created more personalized activation. Then great. You can use Bento, you can run those experiments, and we have a great baseline. But for many of our customers, it's like, we would like to start to introduce some type of product-led experience, but there's no baseline. And so I think in a world where it's fuzzy, but ROI is important, ironically, I think actually having that dialogue with your customer now becomes more important than ever. And I think if we talk about balance, I think it's really important that companies don't go super, super hard on product-led self-serve, never talk to a human, and then miss the opportunity to understand what is the ROI of what your tool is delivering. Because even if people can use the tool, it's very simple and it's delightful. If when it comes to renewal, their CFO asks them, okay, if you didn't have this better whiteboarding tool, it's your favorite one, what if you just did Zoom instead? They can't answer that question. It doesn't matter how delightful your product is. And so I think, that is also one of the balances. If you're going to go into the very, very self-serve, no-touch motion, I always like to ask, how are you going to augment your ability to understand the ROI of your tool?
This is very valuable perspective. I think our listeners are primarily like from the product design world. However, I also read the State of UX in 2024 recently and 2023. And it's clearly that design world should become more business savvy. And this conversation was purely about business, I think. And for our listeners and for us, it's an opportunity to zoom out a little bit and see other things that are happening around the actual product building perspective, and not just look in Figma and pixels, but also zoom out a little bit and see the perspective behind that. Like, what is happening from the investment perspective? What are their expectations? What is happening in the market? And how the whole process of building the company and product looks like. So I think this is why this conversation is very valuable. And thanks, Emily, for sharing all of these beautiful insights. I think before we let you go, we want to ask you some final questions as a lightning round. It's a tradition here. Don't think a lot, but just, say whatever is top of your mind. The first one I wanted to ask you, because I remember when we had a first chat with you, and when I looked through Bento positioning, I've noticed everboarding as a term, and it sticks to me. I really like that. And this is why I want to ask you, onboarding versus everboarding. What do you choose and why?
Yeah, onboarding is part of everboarding. Everboarding just says it's not just about Nux and your new user experience. It's about your nth user experience, and it's about your first user's eighth experience. And I think it actually must resonate really well with designers as we think about design systems, right? It's not just about a discrete experience, but really cultivating a journey throughout the multiple, hopefully, years a person is using your product. So everboarding really just acknowledges, right, that it is ever ongoing, and that those moments of activation does not deserve to just be a one-off project, but really needs to be a system that we get to continue to iterate on, think about, and incorporate.
I love that as a simple word to represent continuous onboarding that I used for the last 5 years. So let's evangelize this vocabulary. I love it. Your favorite book about leadership?
Oh, yeah. A book I recommend to almost everyone I work with is called Leadership and Self-Deception. We talk a lot about growth mindset in Silicon Valley, but I actually think the thing that unlocks growth mindset is really understanding how our own framing of the world sometimes accidentally puts us into a victim mindset. And leadership and self-deception really says we have to not deceive ourselves about whether somebody is really doing things that is, damaging to us or frustrating to us, but it's all about how we kind of can shift our own perspective on the challenges and situations. I try to reread it almost every year because, again, one thing you can always count on is that the human memory is very short. So, yeah.
This is amazing advice, I think. I wish I could have time to reread some books because I have a list of 50 more books to read, and it's hard to reread some old ones. Wonderful. Last one, imagining we are on the time machine, getting back to your amazing times at Harvard. What was your favorite memory about studying there? Because for me, when I look at these communities and universities, it looks like a dream. Probably I would like to study there, maybe just a couple of quarters someday. But you've been there. What was your favorite moment?
It's a hard one to pick, to be honest. I do think there's a lot of great memories of just being with some great friends, truly great friends, whether it was, traveling. I got a chance to travel to places like Nicaragua, but also North Korea when I was with Harvard. Yeah. But also just really fun experiences. We had a class where they encouraged everyone to team up and build micro businesses. And the group that I was with decided to help local restaurants use their restaurant space and capacity in off hours for events and for classes. I mean, it didn't end up being a very good idea, but it was one of the first times that, we really tried to build a business together, which was quite fun.
Very fun. Wonderful. And last thing, where can people find you to connect, to follow your thoughts? Is there any place where it's best to stay in touch with you?
Yeah, LinkedIn is definitely where you'll find me. And otherwise, people can always reach me, by email. I'm just emily@trybento.co.
Thanks, Emily, for this wonderful conversation. Lots of insights. I hope our listeners will find it useful and zoom out from the day-to-day job to look at that from a helicopter view, like building a company and different parts connected to that.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for listening. If you found it valuable, you can support Growthmates by sharing this episode with your friends and colleagues. Subscribe to our show on your favorite platforms and get all episodes to your inbox by subscribing to katesyuma.substack.com. Let's keep growing together.